Good vibrations.
All right, so today's guest is a returning one. We last featured him towards the end of 2017, so it's been a little over a year. It's welcome back to author, researcher, filmmaker John Potash. Hey, John.
Thanks for having me back.
No worries. We had a really good discussion last time based around your two significant books, and I made the point then that the titles pretty much tell you everything you need to know about what's in them. So it's Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac and other leftists, and then the FBI war on Tupac Shakur and black leaders, US intelligence's murderous targeting of Tupac, MLK, Malcolm, Panthers, Hendrix, Marley, rappers and linked ethnic leftists. I think you covered it all there. And we're talking today because you've got a film out which is about 2 hours in length, called Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War on Musicians and Activists. It's right up my street in terms of subject matter. So is the film basically the content of the books put into documentary form, or are you presenting a whole load of different material with this?
No, it's pretty much the contents of Drugs as Weapons Against Us.
Okay.
But only being 60 pages, a 2-hour film is basically based on a 60-hour script, and because it's much shorter, because my book's about 450 pages, it can't have as much information as the book has. It might have one or two different new bits of information just that I came across on film, but basically it's the contents of the book.
Sure. I guess this has been keeping you busy pretty much since we last spoke. I can imagine it's quite a mammoth undertaking.
It is. It has been. And so it's great to have it out there finally. And now it's about trying to get the word out despite mainstream media censorship of topics like this.
Sure.
So I appreciate forums like yours for getting this, the word out on it.
Well, no problem. There's a lot of overlap between my work, actually, talking about all the shenanigans and all the nefarious stuff that goes on in the corporate music industry, and what you talk about, because drugs do enter the picture, and you talk about a lot of high-profile musicians that have made the pages of my books as well. So we can talk about some of that.
Right.
Maybe you just want to give a basic synopsis for people that might not have read the books of what's contained in the film, then.
Sure. So it's basically saying the film goes over the history of how opium traders gain basically global dominance by gaining great wealth in the opium trade and rising up in the United States, starting the Ivy League colleges, starting secret societies or clubs, like Skull and Bones is the most famous one, but in most of the Ivy League colleges. And then some of the people that graduated from those Ivy League clubs, such as the Rockefellers and some John Pierpont Morgan and the Vanderbilts and Carnegies, and all, how they came to dominate American society, but also be some of the most powerful forces in the world, along with their kind of brethren in Britain, and so and other Western countries, of course. But I focus mostly on the U.S. and show how they started the CIA. They started a project called MK Ultra, which had 199 sub-projects. And MK Ultra's documents say it's the use of drugs in unconventional warfare. And so I show how that unconventional warfare was played out in terms of manipulating musicians to promote drugs, but then when they started sobering up and becoming more political, they were done away with, many of them, or they were at least neutralized in other ways by being scared into being silent on a number of issues, political issues. And then the drugs were also mainly, really the biggest target, of course, was the activists, such as the civil rights activists and the anti-war activists. And I show how drugs hurt the different movements, civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and how they were used in that way for social control, basically.
I wonder how many times the CIA has been in breach of its charter with everything it's got up to over the years. I mean, it must be thousands of breaches, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, Seymour Hirsch, a New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, had articles in the early 1970s. Some that he just broke, stories that he broke himself, some that were based on U.S. Senate Church Committee findings. But basically that projects like MKUltra and Chaos, another program of the CIA's, were targeting activists in the United States.
And yet they continually get away with it, it seems, with no accountability. Yeah.
And so, I mean, whistleblowers have said how these projects continue to today, just under different names.
Sure. They have to rename them from time to time. It's like Al-Qaeda becoming ISIS or ISIL, or whatever the hell they're calling themselves this week. They're taking a bit of a holiday at the moment, it seems.
Yeah, definitely.
On the beach. So, are we talking about collusion between the FBI and the CIA in this whole narrative? Are both those agencies involved?
Yeah, basically, I use the CIA for project, to show Project MKUltra's work and reach. But when I say CIA, I basically am referring to all of U.S. intelligence that were collaborating on projects like this, because that's the way I found it usually works. You've got Army intelligence collaborating with their projects at Fort Detrick, chemical warfare location headquarters in Fort Detrick. You've got all different kinds of intelligence working on this. FBI, an undercover FBI agent named David Schneiderman, for example, was outed by the Daily Mail in the 2000s about his work in getting Mick Jagger to take his first hit of LSD. And this guy Schneiderman was called the Acid King, and he was also found to be working at the same time for British MI5, which, of course, is British FBI.
Sure. So there's also collusion between American and British agencies here, it seems. British military intelligence, MI5, MI6, Tavistock Institute, consults very closely with the CIA. And when you look at some of the personnel that actually got the CIA going when it evolved out of the OSS, you find the likes of Gregory Bateson and then later Aldous Huxley. And these are all British people that had a role in getting those agencies off the ground. So there seems to be a lot of collaboration between the two nations.
Yeah, now I understand if you comment on Aldous Huxley and other people have. I just comment on him as a guy that was going blind and was manipulated. I mean, I don't know what his true intentions are, but I argue that he might have been manipulated to promote these psychedelics, but I just don't know for sure. So you might better evidence about him.
Sure. Well, his family has a lot of history of social engineering and such. Yeah.
Sure.
And Aldous Huxley died on the very same day as JFK, 22nd of November 1963. But, his death seems to have been overshadowed by that more high-profile one. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I forgot about that, and that's an interesting coincidence. But yeah,
there was someone else that died on that day as well. I think it may have been C.S. Lewis, the writer. So, what kind of people do you have giving interviews and testimonies in your documentary?
Yeah, well, I start out with a really great British researcher named Frances Stoner Saunders, who's a magazine editor in your country, who wrote the book The Cultural Cold War, the CIA and Arts and Letters, and her take on the media and the CIA and the way it all, how the CIA was basically acting as America's Ministry of Culture, she says, in the way that they funded huge amounts of artists and writers in our country, and covertly, of course, through foundations, front groups. But I also quote. I have John Stockwell talking in my film. I've got he's a CIA whistleblower who talks about the CIA transporting heroin from the Vietnam Golden Triangle region to the United States, and Judy Woodruff, who's a major NPR commentator, National Public Radio commentator, who in I think it was a Frontline report, talked about how the CIA documents admit that they were transporting heroin from Vietnam to the United States. And go on to whistleblowers such as CIA whistleblower Phil Agee about the way the police worked with the CIA, police intelligence all over the country, and the way they targeted the Black Panthers and other activist groups throughout the United States. and people, FBI whistleblowers such as Wes Swearingen, who talked about how these programs continued, but how they murdered Black Panther leader Fred Hampton and some other Black Panthers who said he was drugged and unconscious when they, of course, an undercover agent got into the Black Panthers, gave him, put drugs in his drinks that night, his Kool-Aid, and had him unconscious in the bed when the police came in and murdered him in his bed. And then I've got whistleblowers such as Wouter Basson, who was head of chemical warfare in South Africa, who was interviewed actually in a British documentary where he says that he admitted that when he was caught trafficking ecstasy into black neighborhoods in South Africa, and his assistant said he was told to manufacture a ton of ecstasy. He said he was also working with Porton Down, your chemical warfare headquarters, and Fort Detrick, U.S. chemical warfare headquarters in the United States. And obviously it was on some of these programs of manufacturing ecstasy, and that was used as a weapon, is used really as a weapon against us here in the United States.
Sure. In my current book and in a lot of the talks that I've done recently, I've drawn parallels between the British dance music scene that kicked off about 30 years ago, where ecstasy suddenly flooded the market and was just appearing in unending quantities, and what happened in the United States in the late 1960s with LSD. And to my mind, it's exactly the same blueprint, just with the details changed, done to a different generation in a different country, but using the same plans. And with drugs at the very centre of the narrative. And not many people seem prepared to accept that that's what this UK scene was all about, particularly party goers and ravers that were part of that whole scene. They're really not having it for the most part, that the drugs could have been put in there by government agencies. But it's not as if we haven't seen this before, right?
Right. This has been going on since Project MKUltra started. And so with LSD, I show how Timothy Leary admitted knowingly doing the CIA's bidding since 1963, and so the whole scene in the Millbrook Mansion. So what way it started with the CIA front companies is the CIA gave loads of money to a group called the Human Ecology Fund out of Cornell Medical School, and that group then gave tons of money to about 45 different colleges to test psychedelics on students, and gave it to hospitals to use psychedelics on patient volunteers, and to use it in prisons. All this LSD and psychedelic mushrooms, etc. So Leary was doing that at Harvard. He got kicked out, him and his cohorts at Harvard. And who takes them up under his wing is the Mellon Hitchcock family, William and Peggy Mellon Hitchcock. And so the Mellon Hitchcocks were one of the wealthiest families in the world. They owned Gulf Oil, they owned Mellon Bank, and other properties. And I showed the evidence. So basically, they then proceeded to open up LSD headquarters under some international psychedelic group around the U.S., about half dozen to a dozen headquarters around the U.S. and in Mexico. And but the biggest headquarters, of course, was at the William Mellon Hitchcock Mansion, which was a 3,000-acre estate with a huge mansion in the center of it that he rented to Leary for about $400 a month, which is pennies, and for that huge complex. And so, and then they proceeded to have all these MKUltra scientists just, put themselves in that mansion, and it was just an hour north of New York City. And I show the evidence of the reason why was to lure influential activists, artists, and musicians up from New York City to that party to get them tripping and to experiment with other drugs on them, psychedelics on them. And to get a lot of the freedom riders, because New York City was the biggest location for white freedom riders who went down south to help the Martin Luther King campaign for civil rights for blacks. And so they did that over there in New York, and then they did the same thing with Ken Kesey, But except Ken Kesey appeared to be unknowing that he was being manipulated. He was a writer in the graduate program at Stanford University, and he accepted today's equivalent of like $150 to try this LSD in an MK Ultra experiment there. And once they got him tripping, they started manipulating him. They gave him a job as a janitor in the hospital there, and then gave him the keys, including to the supply of LSD. He supposedly stole LSD continuously and had parties at his place to make it look like a grassroots phenomenon, this LSD, promotion, this LSD partying. And so then this group of people, they call themselves eventually the Merry Pranksters, surrounded him. Many of them were military, and I have them talking about, even admitting that they were military and what they were doing in the military before joining the Merry Pranksters. And they surrounded him, they manipulated him, they got him to paint this bus psychedelic colors around 1964, take it all the way through the Civil Rights South, and then up to New York, where it was headed for him to receive some kind of award. They took it through Harlem right after one of the biggest race riots in the United States, and they, of course, activists call them race rebellions. And so then they came back to the San Francisco Bay Area, where Stanford is, and also, and started holding these acid tests, they called them, which were huge parties promoting LSD, but they would have vats of Kool-Aid. They call it electric Kool-Aid, which was Kool-Aid filled with LSD. And so people would come to these parties and hear the Grateful Dead band playing in these parties, and then drink something when they were hot and sweaty from dancing to the Grateful Dead, and end up being dosed with LSD. Some knew it, some didn't. But those parties got bigger and bigger. But after the first 2 or 3 of those parties, Kesey said he wanted to stop the parties, stop the acid tests, and tell people to graduate from acid. So at that point, of course, police come in and arrest him. And the military folks that had surrounded him then proceed to have even bigger acid tests. They called the TRIPS Festival. At those festivals, at those acid tests, a guy named the top psychologist for MK Ultra, John Gittinger, says in a legal deposition that he was there with 2 other MK Ultra scientists coming all the way from Washington to the San Francisco Bay Area for these parties, supposedly underground parties. And 2 other members of MK Ultra were also there, present at the TRIPS Festival, for example. So, it just shows these to be what they call in the public relations industry as fake grassroots campaigns. They call them AstroTurf campaigns. And so it appears that these acid tests and all these uprisings of acid parties, and then the Human Beings, which was even larger, about 10,000, people attended the Human Being, where they tested all kinds of super MK Ultra psychedelics on, most of the people there, which, they turned out to be MK Ultra experiments, is what it appears based on all the evidence. And they just got bigger and bigger with the music fest that we all love. But sad thing is they kept testing more and more different drugs at a lot of these music fests and promoted these psychedelics and other drugs more and more, so that people in the activist groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, the biggest anti-war activist group of its time, by 1969 it was about 100,000 strong. They ended up getting influenced to use acid, even though some of the leaders were anti-LSD, saying it was anti-revolutionary, and I show how the undercover agents then dosed them at parties to get them to change their mind about acid.
Sure. 50th anniversary of Woodstock coming up this August, which was kind of like the East Coast version of everything that was going on in California at that time, I guess. And then we've got the 50th anniversary of the Manson murders, the Tate LaBianca thing coming up that same month. 50th anniversary of the fake moon landings. And that's what a former friend of mine, Dave McGowan, does a good job of explaining why he thinks they're fake. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, you knew Dave?
Well, we started emailing back and forth when I first came out with my book, and we were comparing notes on publishers, and we were comparing notes on our books, and we were going to trade books, and I sent him my book, and he was about to send me his book too when he found out he had stage 4 cancer all of a sudden, and then passed away 6 months later. Sure. So his brother Craig sent me the book. He was supposed to send me only one copy left, actually, and that was, I think it was Program to Kill. I'm pretty sure it was Program to Kill. I think is the one they sent me. But yeah, which is an excellent book. But yeah, so it's just really sad and scary to find out what happened to Dave when I just started communicating with him.
Well, it is, yeah, and he also passed away on the 22nd of November. Talking about that date as we were earlier, 2015.
Wow, that was JFK's assassination day. Yeah,
right.
Wow.
Yeah, I read Program to Kill earlier this year, and of course I'm familiar with Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which was his masterpiece, exposing all the military family backgrounds of all these musicians that were so central to the 60s counterculture. That's a highly influential piece of work that set me off on the path that I'm currently on, and other researchers as well. So Dave's work was absolutely invaluable in terms of a legacy that he left behind, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think Program to Kill was better written, but I agree Weird Scenes has more, maybe more interesting subjects, sure.
Yeah. Just talking about the Kool-Aid being laced with LSD at the Merry Pranksters gatherings and all this, as you were. Are you familiar with a record by the punk group called the Fugs, called CIA Man?
I know the Fugs, but I don't know CIA Man.
Yeah, they got a great line in it, which goes, "Who can take the sugar from the sack? Pour in LSD and put it back. Fucking A Man, CIA Man." I love that lyric.
Wow, that's great. I didn't know that song. I gotta look that up.
Yeah, that's great. So many of the musician names that you cite as having been targeted by the FBI and the CIA with drugs, their names often come up in research pertaining to them having been some kind of stooges of the military intelligence communities themselves. Names like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, the Beatles, Keith Moon, Kurt Cobain, Tupac keep coming up. Has your own research thrown up anything to suggest that any of these people were placed into these positions in order to have a controlling effect on culture? So, in other words, they were always compromised from day one because their careers were created for them, versus them having made it to prominence off their own backs and working really hard and getting there against all the odds.
Well, I think it's always a different degree of this going on, of the way you described it. There's a degree of that going on with I think with most musicians, because the powers that be control the industry so much. Now, I think that the least like the way you described it is Tupac Shakur. He was born into a what's called a revolutionary family, but really just a socialist family of Black Panthers. And his mother called him the Black Prince of the Revolution, and so he was already a New African Panther leader, which was the New African Panthers were active in 8 to 10 cities around the country when Tupac was about 17 or 18 years old. So he was already a national black leader before he became a rapper, and so of course the FBI's counterintelligence program, which targeted leftists in the U.S., but particularly black leftists, and brutally. And really assassinated many Black Panthers, would focus on Tupac, and so I'll get into. So basically, he was targeted. They targeted him for murder from the first album he put out. Tupac Snow, and because it had a lot of political lyrics, and so he was. I argue at the end of his life, the CIA came in and tried to manipulate his music and basically put out the most negative lyrics he had ever written. Yeah, but hit him up. But after he broke away, after he said, he finished his contract with Death Row and he was leaving them. Of course, they had to do him in because they knew he was going back to his, Panther extended family. And what he was also doing, though, was getting Bloods and Crips, the largest gangs in the United States, to call peace truces and turn on to activism. And that was part of his Black Panther extended families, program, what they were trying to do, and were being very successful with Tupac's help. And this was taking loads of drug dealers off the streets, stopping their drug dealing and turning on to, more legal means for making money. And it was taking huge amounts of money out of the CIA traffickers' hands and huge amounts of money out of the bankers and, corporate stockholders' hands. That were, for all the money that was drug money that was laundered to the banks and other corporations. So that was really what did him in. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, from the way you described these kind of fake celebs, where it's like Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Well, Crosby himself, in particular, coming from the Van Cortlandt family, which is a major highway in New York. But he comes from a very wealthy blue blood family in America with also military links. But you got John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. These were all described by Dave McGowan in his great book, Weird Scenes. And I have him in the movie talking about some of this stuff. And also, a minute or two on Weird Scenes and Laurel Canyon. And so I show that was another version of Haight-Ashbury's scene, which was completely infested with undercover agents promoting all kinds of psychedelics and other drugs. So those were two of the main sites that started, of course he says that Laurel Canyon started the hippie movement, and he could be right about that, but obviously Haight-Ashbury was a major, kind of starter of a lot of the psychedelic movement too.
Sure.
And so they're both, with Laurel Canyon, of course, you had the Air Force film studio Lookout Mountain, which did even more to promote drugs. And I argue that in Laurel Canyon, they had all these parties with all these American propped up musicians that were sent to, the top 10 immediately as soon as they started, the Mamas and the Papas, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, America, all these names well known by 60s
the Byrds.
folks. The Byrds, and all. So, but I argue that when the MK Ultra deputy director Robert Lashbrook went to England, went to London with tons of money, tons of acid, and tons of agents. This is according to A.E. Hotchner, Hemingway's longtime editor, in his book about the Stones called Blown Away. He says that Lashbrook instructed his agents to get acid in as many musicians' hands as possible. And with a few months after that, John Lennon and George Harrison, the Beatles, were dosed with LSD. It was George Harrison's dentist put in their coffee. And to do something like that so brazenly shows he was obviously working for a higher authority to show that he had legal immunity to do something like that. And so, and now, of course, Lennon was furious. Harrison didn't even know what acid was. And then they end up within a year at a party being thrown by David Crosby. And Peter Fonda was there, and he was involved in the Laurel Canyon scene, and other musicians and actors involved in the Laurel Canyon scene were at this party right near Laurel Canyon. And John Lennon and Harrison and Ringo Starr Lennon and Harrison are influenced to take acid a second time, and Ringo Starr for the first time. And so then loads of agents around them, undercover agents around them, really influenced them, the Beatles, to come out with Magical Mystery Tour, which was a huge promotion of acid, and showed them on a bus, which was like a psychedelic bus similar to Ken Kesey's bus that went across the country. Yeah. Which is similar to, they call it the Magic Bus, or whatever you else want to call it. I think the Who talked about it, Magic Bus. But they admitted that was based on Kesey's, psychedelic bus. And so that was a huge promotion of LSD. So it shows that Lennon was a little bit more of a duped and manipulated, of course. But then when he got out of that manipulation, when Marshall McLuhan, McGill University, convinced him he was being manipulated, he got more into his activism and tried to get away from drugs, more for good.
By the time of Magical Mystery Tour, according to the theories, the original Paul McCartney was no longer on the scene and he'd been replaced. Have you looked into that whole thing? Do you go for that idea?
Just a little bit. I know Dave McGowan said he didn't go for it.
Oh, he totally rejected it, and he would cut people off that even mentioned it and have nothing to do with them. He really didn't go for that at all.
Yeah, I didn't look into it. I looked into it a little bit. I just couldn't tell how I felt about it enough to speak about it. So I just don't know about it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how valid it seems or what.
I've got some new shows coming on that. I've got a podcast and also a live talk, which I'll be releasing soon. So you might find that of interest.
Okay.
Just going back to Tupac, the thing that kills me about him is that he trained in ballet in Baltimore, an art school in Baltimore, and he did stage acting, Shakespearean style acting, and then a few years later he's this kind of thug rapper in terms of the image he's putting forward, and he's this tough guy gangster sort of persona.
So I'll explain that, yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of that was an act, given that he was literally an actor.
Yeah, no, it was an act, and I'll tell you why. So I live in Baltimore. I'm speaking from Baltimore. And so I talked to some of his professors here in Baltimore, and they told me that, basically he was considered the best actor ever to come out of the Baltimore School for the Arts. That Jada Pinkett Smith came out of there, and she knew how incredible of a talent he was, and donated the money to create the Tupac Shakur Performing Arts Center at the Baltimore School for the Arts, donated millions of dollars for that. And so Tupac, at a certain point around the time around the time of his first album or just after his first album, he did decide to help his Black Panther, extended family with this thug life plan, and that plan was to pretend to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. So yes, he was just an intellectual progeny. He would rewrite Shakespeare plays in modern language, direct, produce, and star in them. When he wasn't still in high school. So he was brilliant, and so he took on this role, to pretend like he was this thug in order to appeal to these gangs and help that politicization of the gangs, and to get them radicalized and in line with the Black Panther politics as much as possible, to the point that a head of the Crips gang came to London to speak to a group called Panther in London, a black militant group called Panther in London. So it was a socialist group in London that he spoke to. So yeah, this was true. He did take on that, and his mentors confirmed that to me. With Tiny Hemba confirmed that, yeah, that's true. That was the plan. That's what he did.
Right. Have there been any developments at all, as far as you're aware, in the whole Tupac and Biggie murder cases, given that the official narrative we've had since 1996-97 is, or as far as the police are concerned, we don't know who did it. The donut-eating bozo cops just don't seem to be able to solve two murders with hundreds of witnesses right there on the strip in Las Vegas and the other one in LA. Nothing seems to have moved in that entire narrative, unless I've missed something. We're just being told we don't know who did it, and that's the end of it.
Well, it has progressed, actually, and that's why he's kind of constantly in the news here. And part of the way it's progressed is a guy named Russell Poole, was a high-level police detective in Los Angeles, turned whistleblower. And when he came across, dozens of his fellow police officers at all levels of Death Row Records, and said, basically, what are they doing there? And his supervisor said, you can consider them covert agents. And so he came out with this to Nick Broomfield, the great British documentary filmmaker, and to what's his name, Sullivan, who wrote a book called Labyrinth, and Randall Sullivan. And so that book was read by many in Hollywood, actually. And so three different Hollywood, moguls tried to make films out of that book. First, it was Sylvester Stallone planned to play Russell Poole in a film based on the book Labyrinth. And that was, announced in the press, but then eventually canned. And then DreamWorks with Leonardo DiCaprio planned to play Randall Sullivan. But that went to a certain point, and then the LA Police Department shut it down, and that shows how much power they have in their work with the CIA. And finally, it was Johnny Depp planning to play Russell Poole, and I actually saw a preview of that film, when I was in the theaters this summer, and just before it was about to be released, they stopped the release. And that's how powerful the CIA is. They can stop all these major motion pictures from coming out at all, even when they're finished. And, and they show the previews. But so Poole did very good work in showing that the Death Row Records, he didn't say this outright. He said the Death Row Records was drug trafficking, and they murdered, the police inside Death Row Records were drug trafficking, and they set up Tupac's murder and Biggie's murder, and he just didn't know exactly why. But all the best evidence is that was a CIA front company, Death Row Records, to promote the most negative aspects of society to, youth in general in the United States. Basically, drinking, smoking weed, gangbang. And it was too bad that Tupac was, part of that and manipulated by that. And then when he was breaking away from that and said he was done with death row, he's finished his contract. He's already developed his own music label. He was murdered, of course. So.
We certainly hear all that regularly when it comes to Death Row Records and Suge Knight, who I believe is still in jail. But on the East Coast, on Biggie's side of things, you had Bad Boy Records run by Sean Puffy Combs, Puff Daddy. And you don't hear his name coming up as often as Suge Knight's in terms of any possible involvement or implication in these murders. And yet, from my own perspective, my own research, Puffy is actually a very dark character. And he's very compromised and has got a lot of skeletons in the closet. I just wonder if you've done any specific research into Puffy and the whole Bad Boy Records empire.
Well, I haven't. I mean, I've done some, but I think he's a very compromised businessman who, when he did try to get somewhat political, someone tried to shoot him. And when that person, he tried to get political, he joined the Hip Hop Summit Action Network, tried to get this blood versus, this East versus West rap war, supposed rap war, which I argue was a manufactured rap war, just like the East versus West Panther War.
Absolutely.
When he tried to get involved in squashing that and promoting an activist agenda of the Hip Hop Summit Action Network, which was actually almost equivalent to the Black Panther 12-point agenda. He was shot at and imprisoned for gun possession and almost went to jail for a long time. They put, when I was living in New York, they said in the news that they put the most money to a gun possession charge ever put to a case like that. The government was trying so hard to put him in jail and keep him in jail, Puffy, and so the FBI was involved, and so when he tried to stray from the intelligence manipulated agenda, he was almost either done away with or put in jail for a long time. So that's just the way it all works by different degrees. So yes, he may have been doing a lot of negative things on behalf of the powers that be. I don't know them all. But I do know at least he was turning away from it, not talking about the negative stuff as much. But he wasn't buying into the East versus West rap war agenda, and he was trying to go activist, and then they neutralized him when he did. So
yeah, you had the record "Who Shot Ya" from Notorious B.I.G., which preceded Tupac's murder, and many people think it was a direct taunting of Tupac lyrically, and it was kind of goading him on, and Puffy was obviously very heavily involved in that.
It certainly could have been. It could have been. Yeah.
My mind goes back to the nightclub shooting incident in 1999 as well, late 99, just coming up on 20 years for that, where Puffy was in a club with J-Lo and Shine, one of the other rappers on his label.
That's the one I'm talking about, that they tried to get him on that gun possession charge, sure.
Right.
But I tell you,
Shine
Mark,
ended up going to jail for that and serving the term.
Right. And the witness, the top government witness, was actually the guy that did the shooting. I mean, he's the one that was really had been caught planning to kill Puffy and Shine, planning to shoot Puffy and Shine. So it's really incredible that way that was set up, and Shine was railroaded. I tell you though, when we're talking about all this, you had mentioned Jimi Hendrix, and so I'd definitely like to talk about Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain too in this.
Sure. Just before we do, I just wanted to mention that before we leave Puffy alone, we had a story towards the end of last year that Kim Porter, the mother to 3 of Puffy's children, died very suddenly, reportedly of pneumonia. So whether or not there's more to know about that, we can only speculate. But
I hear you.
I just throw it into the mix for people to consider.
I can understand. There's so much to find out about these people. I agree.
Sure. Yeah, you were going to talk about Hendrix and Cobain there?
Yeah, I mean, Hendrix was interesting in Britain just because of the fact that he couldn't, because of racism, American racism, I argue, he couldn't make it big in the U.S. He goes over to Britain. He's immediately recognized as a guitar genius,
right?
And gets instant stardom, but he couldn't handle the stardom, and so a guy named Mike Jeffrey inserts himself into Hendrix's career and becomes his manager. And Jeffrey, of course, was former MI6, he says, and all the evidence shows that he continued to be MI6. For American listeners, that's British CIA. And so, and then, of course, within 48 hours of Hendrix finally firing Mike Jeffrey, Hendrix dies mysteriously. And two people said that that Mike Jeffries, when he was drunk, admitted to having Hendrix killed.
Yeah.
And who can do that unless they have intelligence connections? Within 48 hours, have someone done away with.
Exactly.
So it just shows that, and he was. Hendrix was getting away from drugs and getting it more into activism at the end of his life, and that's basically the pattern. When these artists start resisting the manipulation and start sobering up and getting more into activism, they're neutralized,
Sure. And so many rock star deaths get chalked up as some kind of undisclosed overdose of one sort or another, and we very rarely get any specific detail, and people are left with these hazy kind of ideas that certain names died of some kind of overdose or other. So if you ask most people what happened to Jimi Hendrix, what happened to Janis Joplin, or Whitney Houston even, and so many of these other people, and we've had Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries more recently last year turned up dead in a bath in a hotel room in London, and eventually the report said, it's some sort of overdose, but we're never told what it's an overdose of, and everything's just left very vague.
Yeah.
Do you get the feeling that, first of all, assuming that these people are getting knocked off and these aren't genuine overdoses by their own hand, these are being done to them, do you get the feeling that those that are causing these sort of things to happen have to go easy on the number of deaths that are chalked up as overdoses so as not to overdo it and raise suspicions? So you'll get the odd suicide and the odd heart attack in the mix, because too many overdoses would start to ring some alarms, right?
Right. I mean, with Cobain, you got to quote. In my film, I just have an expert like Cyril Wecht, former president of the American Academy of Forensic Science, says in a news program in my film that he believes Kurt Cobain was murdered and it was made to look like a suicide. This is just the modus operandi of U.S. and British intelligence in these cases, and were accidental deaths like Jimi Hendrix, and show all the evidence of how that wasn't the way the media talked about it. They pretended like it was
whatever's supposed to have happened.
Heroin related. Yeah. And now Morrison was a little close, was part of the Laurel Canyon scene. It was more what McGowan said was a guy that came right out of military intelligence, with his father being head of the ship that caused the Gulf of Tonkin incident that caused the Vietnam War.
Right.
But then I do believe that he turned on his family and the manipulations a bit once he started sobering up, and then was done away with. But I couldn't get into as much. I didn't talk about Morrison in my book or film any more than the initial kind of way he got into things. But with Cobain, of course, I showed the evidence that he was sober before he died, and with the blood test in Rome. And have him talking about how he cured his stomach problem, which was the way that he was psychologically profiled to get him using heroin daily, because opiates can help stomach problems in a big way, and he had a massive stomach problem. But then when he found the cure to his stomach problem, he said he was feeling great after that, and then he was sober, and then he was getting he was always into activism, and show the evidence of that, but he. And then he was done away with. And, of course, I have Eldon Hoke, one film from Nick Broomfield's film, talking about how Courtney Love offered him $50,000 to blow Kurt Cobain's head off. And so there's just loads of evidence about Cobain in that regard. And the film has a lot of these people saying these things on film, and I'm glad to at least get the word out there about these great musicians. And, of course, you mentioned Joplin, and the first fiance of Janis Joplin was a guy who had said to another girlfriend that he worked for the FBI. And of course, she found out he had a whole wife and kids in another state, whole another family in another state, and stopped the marriage before it happened. But Joplin he hooked her on amphetamines, And that's some of the ways this all works. And these are some of the tactics and the ways they manipulate our musicians to promote the drugs and all.
A lot of people seem to think that Janis Joplin's death was connected to Jimi Hendrix's in some way, given that she died something like 3 weeks after he did. And people have speculated on whether she had some inside knowledge of what was done to Hendrix, and she was deemed a potential loose cannon and had to be silenced herself.
I haven't heard that. I can believe it for sure. I just haven't heard that. I do know, and I show her. I have a clip of her on the Dick Cavett show in my film, talking about how she had planned to do 2 unprecedented anti-war concerts at first at Shea Stadium and then at a Philadelphia stadium, New York Stadium and a Philadelphia stadium, with other musicians for peace benefits, anti-war benefits. Just totally unprecedented in sheer size and numbers that it would have been. And so she's killed right before doing that. But that's interesting about Hendrix and knowledge about how he died. I haven't heard that, but I can believe it. It's possible, sure.
Sure, and Hendrix was over in London, Janis was in California, but as we said, there's these transatlantic links and everything is connected between the UK and the US, it seems, and there's so many examples of that. Yeah, sure. I mean, with Hendrix, he was in London, as you say, when he died, but FBI supposedly had him under 24-hour surveillance, according to the top biographers of Hendrix. Yeah. I think I asked you the last time we spoke if you had anything on Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington and their very shocking demises. I'm not sure if you've looked into those two guys in the interim at all.
Not much, just a bit to find that, yes, they both were getting involved in, they both had been, my understanding is that I believe that they were both abused when they were young, maybe as kids.
I think they both said that they were, yeah.
Yeah, and then they both were getting into activism against child abuse and pedophilia and those kinds of issues. They were both getting involved in different activist groups, or maybe the same one, I can't remember. But, and so that was an interesting parallel between those two. And so that's, I can't remember what else I found besides that. And I wish I could have researched them more, but so basically my book and film are just giving examples of how this is all happening, but there's just so many others out there that it's just hard, one person just only has so much time to research, so I'm glad you're researching the same stuff, Mark.
Absolutely, and there's such a large number of musicians who state that they were sexually abused as kids. I mean, it goes way beyond the average, what you would expect. Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington, I think, both made statements to that effect. Dolores O'Riordan, who I mentioned earlier of the Cranberries, she states that she was abused by a close family member when she was very young. Sinead O'Connor has said the same thing. Pete Townsend of The Who has talked about the same thing. Terry Hall, the singer with the Specials, I saw in an interview recently, was talking about having been abused as a kid. So this just keeps on coming up. It's definitely a thing.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's, that's partly what that one particular project of MK Ultra is about. And so I talk about that in my book regarding Courtney Love. Her history.
You do a whole damn film on her, right?
You really could, and it's. I had to start my film, regarding her. I had to start in her teenage years, because if I would have gone, I devote a whole chapter of my book to just Courtney Love and her bizarre development with being abused, saying she was abused in her, by her therapist and psychiatrist when she was an infant, and her own mother writes in her memoir she thinks she was abused at one of the daycare centers. She thinks that Courtney was abused in one of the daycare centers. And so she apparently wrote this letter to her dad saying they all had sex with her, all her therapists as a kid. And they also gave her psychohypnotic drugs, which were MK Ultra drugs. And so it appears that, yes, she fit that pattern in order to now when kids are abused between the ages of 3 and 8 years old, it doesn't always, but it can lead to dissociative disorder or dissociative identity disorder. and that's probably better known as split personality or multiple personality disorder. It's now called dissociative, identity disorder.
Right.
But I just show the evidence that was part of the MK Ultra process, which was that replicated by the Process Church and the top psychologists working on these issues with patients who had were abused or had dissociative identity disorder, had lectured nationally about this issue, about how the Process Church is present, and that's the cult that Manson was most linked with, Charles Manson, the murderer. And so they were present throughout the country, and their techniques for child abuse and manipulation were exactly replicated CIA's MK Ultra program doing that, and it couldn't have been a coincidence. It had to be the same. It had to be an extension of CIA's MK Ultra, just putting that layer, which they always do. They always put a group in between them and the actual abuse or murder in order to hide what they're doing, better.
Yeah. And all kinds of people are connected to the Process Church when you get into it. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer. Sirhan Sirhan is implicated with that group. There's connections going into the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. It never ends. But I think we'll start to wrap it up here, mate. We should probably let people know where they can see the film, first off. So let us know where that resides, and any of your other work that you want to promote as well. Let us know about that.
Well, thanks, Mark. So Amazon Prime just started showing my film here in the U.S. and I think Canada also. So you can see it there, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. Just plug that into Amazon Prime and you can find it. But my movie website's drugsasweaponsmovie.com, and then my book and movie website's drugsasweapons.com. It's being sold a lot of places here in the U.S., but mostly online. It's also being sold. Some Barnes and Noble stores actually have the film there, but usually you have to order it. So it's sold at Barnes and Noble. It's sold by Best Buy, Target, Walmart. Amazon, of course, sells it. Regular Amazon sells a hard copy of the film, but of course Amazon Prime's also showing it. Website, online places such as Vudu, Vimeo, where else? iTunes, Microsoft Xbox, Google Play, and YouTube Rent are ways people can see this film.
Sure. And just in wrapping up, this is how I feel about things, and I suspect you'll be with me on it. As fascinating and tantalizing as it is to get into all this information about all the rock star deaths and all the sordid stuff going on with drugs and stuff, I personally just wish it would stop. I just want it to stop. I would much prefer not to have to do books and shows on this type of material, because it just goes on and on and on forever. We're talking about stuff on this show that happened 4 or 5 decades ago, and it's still going on now. So I just want it all to come to an end, and people becoming aware of the tactics that are used and getting used to the idea that these government agencies and these intelligence agencies that masquerade as being there to protect us and to represent our interests are anything but. There just needs to be far more acceptance of the true roles of these organisations if this shit is ever to come to an end. And so that's why I do shows like this, and it's probably why you do as well.
I completely agree.
That's how I feel about the whole thing. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I completely agree. People think that I'm happy about this to write about it and make money off of it, and it's very depressing to me. I feel the same as you. I only keep researching and writing about this stuff to help stop it.
Exactly.
And for people to move on to better things, to have more, better minds without the drugs, and for us to be able to have these musicians, great artists and musicians much longer, and these great activists much longer. And it's very sad that this keeps going on, and we have to keep, reporting on the tactics to try to stop it. Yeah.
Yeah. But for as long as it's going on, we'll continue.
Yeah.
Do what needs to be done.
Sure. So thanks so much, Mark, for helping me spread this word to try to help stop it. Yeah. And for doing your great research and writing too, for trying to stop it.
No worries, man. That's a good point to leave it. Thanks for coming on today.
You're very welcome. Take care, Mark.
This is just for fun.
I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up good vibrations. I'm picking up